gathering, and this week we're delighted to welcome someone who left Kilkenny some time ago geographically, but hasn't left it in relation to the work that he's doing. Ian Hamilton was a Master Brewer at Smithwicks Brewery, and in 2016 established Sullivan's Brewery in John Street. Ian, you're very welcome to join us today. Thank you for giving your time to us. If only we had a Sullivan's drink in front of us, that would entice people even further. Yes, you hear that? Anyway, Ian, I'm going to hand over to Ian, who's going to tell us a little bit about the development of brewing in Kilkenny and how Sullivan's evolved.
Can I just add that Alan Smithwick, who's appearing there as Alan's iPad, is joining us for this as well. So he'll be able to, Alan, I hope you'll be able to correct me on the worst mistakes I make in the history of the Sullivans.
Oh, I think you're correcting my mistakes all the time anyway.
I'm hoping you can all see that picture of a slightly younger Ian Hamilton. And that's when we were doing one of our weirder brews in the tap room, the Irish Wildflower Pale Ale. So we had infused some plants that were collected in Kilkenny that morning, some meadow sweet and some antler sumac and plants like that, which are found around Kilkenny. So it made it a very interesting, slightly odd beer. We've also done some other strange ones you'll hear about during the presentation. So what I want to do first is play a short video, which I hope will work. So let me just, I'll stop sharing for a second while I pick a new one.
Kilkenny, 1702. Old Master Sullivan, our great-great-great-grand something, set up the first commercial brewery in Ireland. A few years later, Old Master Smithwick, our great-great-great-grand something else, set up the second. Cue a centuries-long rivalry in the Kilkenny beer brewing trade that even resulted in an interbrewery marriage or two. The Sullivan clan were the wild, unpredictable one of the two families, but they always made sure to live by their family motto, stand up and do the right thing. Be it opening their doors of the brewery to the starving masses during the Great Famine, or giving up a coveted seat in Parliament to the Great Emancipator, the Sullivans throughout the years have always put what's right before what suits them. It wasn't all plain sailing though. In 1918, the young Master Sullivan lost the entire Maltings brewery to a bet on a horse in France. So while brewing is in our blood, gambling, it would appear, definitely isn't. As a result, Sullivan's was taken in by Smithwicks, and the two families were joined by something other than a few marriages. Smithwicks was later bought by Guinness, which meant that by 2013 there wasn't a single drop of drink being brewed in Kilkenny. But when Sullivan and Smithwick blood flows through your veins, it's hard to stay away from the brewing trade for long. Hence why Paul Smithwick kick-started the old family business for the first time in decades and brought together a brewing dream team with over 100 years experience building beer businesses around the world. And luckily, not much had changed in the interim, and Kilkenny still proved itself to be one of the few places in the world to have all four ingredients key to making some of the highest quality beer in the world. We won an award for Best Ale in the World straight out the gate. There was no question that with a little time away, the Sullivan and Smithwick blood was pumping stronger than ever through the veins of Dan and Alan. From the start, we made sure to honour our family motto of stand up and do the right thing. We promote smaller, less established breweries through our Kilkenny-based creative hub, The Tap Room, and collaborate with people who've the passion but not the means to make their own craft beer. This lets us have fun and go wild, experimenting with whatever idea takes us. Ever wondered what a kiwi and lime flavoured pale ale tastes like? We have you sorted. And when it came to breaking America, we steered away from the big cities and instead focused on somewhere that was more like our hometown of Kilkenny, the Great Lakes. Our first port of call, Buffalo. After that, we're looking to Saratoga, Albany, Cleveland and Pittsburgh. And luckily our American family, like Frank and Michael here, are the same hard-working, fun-loving guys we are. We're not chasing trends or looking to the mainstream. We're just a family business looking to stake Kilkenny's claim as a great international brewing city once again, make the beer we want to make on our terms, spread our reach across the States, Britain and anywhere there are people that love brand-led, high-quality craft beer, and do right by the iconic name that's on our glasses. Oh, and to keep Smithwicks on their toes once again. As long as Sullivan and Smithwick blood flows through our veins, we're not going anywhere.
So don't worry, this will not be a brewing lecture. Most of the slides are just photographs, but just a little bit of the intro. So beer has been brewed for a very long time. We'll talk a little bit about the history of it. So what I'll talk about today is a bit about the background to brewing, the history, and then head into Irish brewing and Sullivan's. And I'm happy to take any sort of questions at the end, as Alan will be as well, I'm sure. So beer is a fermented beverage made from malt, which is partially germinated barley, which is then dried. So the great thing about malt is when you have a good malt and you crush it in warm water, it basically converts itself into an ideal food for yeast to turn into beer. So we go through malting, milling of the grain, mashing of the grain, then it's boiled with the addition of hops, which add the bitterness and some aroma. And then we cool that down to allow us to add yeast. And the yeast is the wonderful sort of secret ingredient that transforms the sugars and all of the other vitamins and everything into beer during the fermentation. Then the beer has to be matured to smooth out the flavor, and then what we call finishing, which might include filtering and getting the beer ready for package. So it's a very natural process. It's been going on for thousands of years. This ancient, in fact. So this is the oldest picture of people having a pint in the whole world. As you can see, it's from Tepe Gawra, northern Iraq, not too far from places like Mosul, which ISIS and others try and stop people having a drink nowadays. But I can't help thinking if people enjoyed a beer in some of these regions, there might be a little less trouble. But that's the very first evidence, pictorial evidence of people having a beer. And it looks a bit strange. They have these strange bent straws for drinking the beer from the earthenware vessel. This is a picture of an ancient Egyptian brewing operation in the Israeli Beer Breweries Museum, of all places. And when I was in Kenya in 2013, working with Guinness over there for a while, I was delighted to see this in the National Museum. So people still drink traditional beers in Africa the same way. So it's a mash of grain, and the grain is still in that pot, you see, having fermented to alcohol. So they stuff a little straw or something in the end of a tube, and they can suck out the beer and leave the gritty bits behind. So that's what that sort of traditional brewing was like. Of course, it's a bit more developed nowadays. You'll all remember that nice day back a few years ago now with President Obama. So Ian, I'm just checking with you. Are the pictures coming through okay? Great. So then the earliest brewing kind of history we have, even older than that picture of the people in Tepe Gawra, is we know that in the Holy Land in Galilee, barley was being cultivated and grown. It probably was first a wild plant in Turkey and places like that, but they were growing barley in a proper farmed way in Galilee 8,500 years ago. Not for brewing, probably, although they are unearthing absolutely definite breweries in archaeology in Israel only a few weeks ago. Then we have Jiahu in China 9,000 years ago, when the first alcoholic fermentation was practiced. Not from barley in this case, it was more like fruits and other grains. But people have found residues from alcoholic fermentation in jugs from that period. Then we have Mosul and Iraq, that whole Fertile Crescent. And there is an argument that people started farming to make beer, not to make bread. The argument being that hunter-gatherers in those days got enough food and could keep going with 2 or 3 hours work a day. I mean, obviously there were lean times as well as flush times. But why would you go through the back-breaking 8 hours a day in the midday sun of farming just so you could eat bread? So there is a theory, and there's a whole school of archaeology on this, that actually the parallel use of grain for making alcohol, for whether it was religious or just for social purposes, might well be the reason people were happy to settle down. Obviously, I like the idea that maybe beer was the source of civilization. Then we have 1800 BC, we have Sumeria, and 1750 Babylon, all references to beer. the Egyptians really did beer in a big way. There's evidence of huge, pre-industrial but huge breweries from that time. The Greeks were quite snobbish about beer. Obviously, they preferred their wine. I think it was Aristotle who said the only benefit of drinking beer was that when you did get drunk, at least you didn't fall on your face. You fell on the back of your head. So that was about as good as the Greeks' references to beer were. They considered it a sort of a strange drink, but it has a history much older than the Greeks. A hymn to the goddess Ninkasi from 1800 BC in Sumeria. It's a very long hymn, but basically it's praising the dear goddess for the production of beer. And that when she pours out the filtered beer from the collector vat, it is like the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates. Ninkasi, you are the one. So, but there are about another 20 verses of this hymn. And then we have Hammurabi. Any lawyers or anyone who studied law on this call will know about Hammurabi. And carved on this basalt pillar under the statue are laws from Babylon. And the laws include the punishments for making bad beer, adulterating beer. And the punishment, I think, is death, which is only fair. And the other thing that I didn't realize for a while was, who is God and who is the king in this picture? Actually, God is the individual sitting down, and the king is standing up, but covering his face in shame. That's my understanding of the picture. So this is the very first legal code ever written down, and it does include beer. Some Egyptians brewing beer. The nice thing about the Egyptians, the different thing that they did was that they brewed their beer from a sort of barley bread. So it was like a home brew kit that they could carry with them. So you had this barley bread and you crumbled it into warm water, and probably had some yeast within it, and it would ferment itself in the warm climate. And there's some evidence that the Irish in the Stone Age brewed in the same way, because malt cakes and barley cakes are mentioned for brewing. So this is about Irish brewing. And the evidence that cereals and brewing reached is in the New Stone Age. So some of the very earliest pottery from Ireland, when it's examined in the kiln where they baked the pottery, they used barley straw. And the way we know this is that the impression of little barley grains is occasionally found in the ancient Irish pottery. So they must have been growing barley back then in the New Stone Age. And then we have these Fulacht Fia, there's even a Fulacht Fia marked in the Kilkenny Golf Club, if any of you are golfers. I've never seen it, but it is marked there. So a Fulacht Fia consists of these kind of crescents of rocks as a windbreak, and then in the center, a pit where water could be stored. The original theory back in the 50s was that these were hunting spots, and when somebody killed a deer, they'd dismember the poor thing, and then they would cook the meat in the water. The water would be heated by heating stones in a fire nearby, as we'll see in a moment. However, an archaeological group called the Moore Group in 2007 decided to test the theory that maybe these were breweries, or at least used as breweries. They called it themselves the Great Irish Beer Experiment. And here it is. So they've their own Fulacht Fia, and you can see they have some period-looking pots and a basket for straining and so on. So they made a wooden trough. So the man at the back is heating up the stones, and the man in the front is preparing the trough with water. So as the stones are being heated up, they can then heat up the water. The basket provides a way of straining the converted mash. So the grains would have reacted in the warm water, releasing their natural sugars and amino acids and so on. Not that the Stone Age people knew about that. And then they could filter out the liquid from the grain and then collect it in the pots where it would ferment. There is a German style of beer called Steinbier, where they do the same thing today. They heat up stones and they put them in the brew kettle. And after the brew has been emptied and moved on, those same hot stones are now covered in a lovely lacquer, a sort of a caramelized lacquer of wort, and those stones are put into the lager vessel with the beer at the end, so that that lovely caramelized flavor dissolves into the beer from the stone. Then in the Middle Ages, we have, this is Bridget in Kildare. I don't know if you've ever been here, because it's a lovely little place to visit. It's her holy well in Kildare. And as you can see, it must be pre-Christian, because this and a few other holy wells have actually sort of stone projections where the water pours out, and they're always in pairs, and they look remarkably like breasts. So that's likely to be a pre-Christian sort of well of worship, which was then Christianized with the cult of Saint Bridget. And she's famous for her brewing miracles. She was able to, a whole bunch of bishops arrived for some sort of a conclave that she hadn't heard about, and she produced beer for them all magically from just one tub of grain. So she was some woman. St. Patrick is also reckoned by some records to have had his own brewer called Mescam. So the oldest records talk about beer using different words: Girdum, Brewer, Ol, which is familiar enough to us, and Olmgula, which may have been boiled or with coal or something like that. Crahor MacNassa and the days of Fionn McCool, there's a whole story about a war where Crahor, the king, had a large brewing kettle, but he didn't have a large barrel to brew the beer. So he raided this other king to take Daradach, which was the big brewing barrel, back to his kingdom. And so one of the earliest Irish wars was over beer, which is probably not the worst thing to fight over. And then as in the 6th century, Shanachas Moore, there is that reference I mentioned to making malt cakes for making beer. It also says that 6 pints of beer a day is okay for a clergyman. You'll be delighted to hear that, Ian. However, during Lent, that was sometimes reduced to 3 pints a day. Now, the thing is that the beer brewed by the ancient Irish would not have had hops. The beer was made from barley, all right, but gruit was used. So gruit was a mixture of herbs that varied wherever you went around Europe, but pine, heather, bog myrtle, juniper, dandelions, ground ivies, mugworts, yarrows, all those kind of things were used, as well as freach or heather. And there is brewing heather beer successfully for some time. Freach being the Irish or Scots Gaelic for heather. Hops stepped in then. They have their own interesting history. They were originally grown as a vegetable. They were eaten like asparagus. And it was only later that, for example, we know that Pepin the Fat, the father of Charlemagne, had hops in his garden in 760 AD. But they discovered that the hop flowers were very nice in beer from about 1100 AD. And then it became quite a thing. For a while, one side of the Reformation favored hops, and the other side of the Reformation favored gruit. And this was linked to tax as well. For example, if you visit Bruges, one of the great art galleries is the Gruit House, where the church stored gruit, and you had to buy it from them. They had a monopoly on gruit. So it was a revenue source for the church as well as important for beer brewing. But eventually, hops have many advantages over gruit, and they're almost universal now in the making of beer. But hops were not grown in England or Ireland until the 1500s, 1600s. There are records of hops being imported to Kilkenny from the port of Bristol in a lot of the records for the duty that was charged on imports. So back to Ireland, you have Kilkenny. You have the Normans have arrived by now, and towns, they established towns, which were not an Irish thing before the Normans. And there's St. Francis Abbey, of course, or Friary in Kilkenny, and a picture of a kind of an early artisan type brewing operation. So you have a beer market. And then we have the tradition in Kilkenny of the St. Francis Abbey and the Abbey brewing. Most of the monasteries would have been brewing beer, is my understanding. If we were in sunnier climes, they would have been making wine, of course. But beer was Northern Europe's tipple. And also most of the establishments had guest houses. So the provision of beer was as much for their own healthy diet as well as for guests. So we know that there was brewing for at least 300 years in that tradition, and they're mentioned in the Annals of John Klyn. And so we have all the Kilkenny stories about Dame Alice, the witch, so-called witch, Bishop Ledreed, that Ian could tell us all about, the Black Death. Then Reformation, which it kind of wasn't an overnight thing, but it meant that the history of brewing in monasteries disappeared because the monasteries themselves disappeared and turned over to other duties. And then you have kind of the suppression of alcohol to some extent by Cromwell, even though Cromwell had a brewery himself. At one point, one of his opponents insulted him by telling him he was a brewer, a mere brewer. But brewing did, of course, continue, but it was now by housewives, alewives, brewsters, but they were not always popular with the male establishment. So this was how they were pictured. This is the famous Mother Louse, and you can even see her coat of arms with 3 lice proceeding at the top there with her ale. So the people who were kind of against alcohol considered the houses that served beer as places of ill repute. There was, for example, but it was often the only way a widow, for example, could keep herself going. So it's funny, there's some connection between these alewives and the picture we have as children of a witch, that they sometimes had these tall black hats, apparently as a sign of what their trade was. But a particular thing they did was when the beer was fresh, when it was ready to drink, they used to, in those semi-literate times, stick a green bough out the window, a green branch. In other words, a broom, a green broom. So the old ladies putting the broom out the window meant witchcraft to some people and meant beer to other people. But then things developed. We have the Industrial Revolution, the very first steam engines and things like that. We're now moving from the 1650s to the 1750s. And within a few years, the steam engine, the thermometer, and the saccharometer, which is very important for brewing, they're all developed. So brewing potentially becomes big business again, but as a private industry now, not from a monastery or abbey. And the government is delighted because, of course, now the charging of duty is easier. They actually gave a big duty break to the bigger brewers, so that they favored bigger breweries over the smaller ones. This led to the, if you like, explosion of what was, for its time, industrial brewing, what the Smithwicks and the Sullivans and the Guinnesses did. So unfortunately, that 100 years or so of female brewing came to an end once there was more money and more tax to be made. It became a male business again. And these are 2 of the sort of Kilkenny stalwarts. So we've Edmonds, Smithwick, that many of you are familiar with. But James Sullivan, that lovely portrait from Alan's house, one of the many Sullivans who owned the Sullivan operation in James's Street. I'm personally very fond of this thing. This is Edmonds steam engine. So an idea of what was going on. This is in the 1840s now, when the families have gradually improved and developed their breweries. So this steam engine was bought in 1847 in England, brought to Ireland, and was operating within kind of living memory in the Smithwicks Brewery. And it's now in the Straffan Steam Museum, in one of the Guinness family runs it. And I've seen that running. On a Sunday, they fire up steam and they can run their steam engines. So that still runs beautifully after all these years. So we won't run through all of these, but the big dates that might be of interest to us today would be, so 1702, first references to Sullivan's brewing, 1710, first references to Smithwicks. And shortly after that, porter invented in England, which swamps the Irish market. You also have the, as I mentioned, thermometer, scientific brewing beginning. And the RDS, the Royal Dublin Society, realizes that the Irish brewing industry is struggling. So it stimulates the development of local porters to try and fight back. And Grattan revokes duty, for example, to encourage the Irish operation. So by 1809, believe it or not, people forget this, the biggest brewery was Beamish. But by 1838, Guinness was the biggest, because Father Matthew's temperance campaign was particularly effective in Cork, which is why we have a statue of him in Patrick Street, I suppose. He was also, funnily enough, quite effective in North America, because I was surprised to find a statue of Father Matthew in Salem, Massachusetts, where he also came to minister to, in many cases, the Irish over there. Then we have Guinness, the world's biggest brewery. Then we have the ale cult starting in the kind of 1960s and 70s. So ale was the lager of its day back then. Huge volume. And we also had people like Heineken coming in, taking over Murphy's and so on, and the growth of lagers. So by the year 2000, there was a change, the development of craft breweries. This is one of the earliest brewing books. If my reading of Roman letters is correct, that's something like 1757 or something like that. The essay on brewing. So you can see the dove of peace carrying the thermometer. You see how important the thermometer was over the fields of barley with the hops growing. So the principles of the art of brewing were being established back then. This is what the breweries would have looked like. So with the kiln roof, because malting would have been carried out with the brewing operation, as it was in Sullivan's, for example, and in Smithwicks. So these roofs would have been for better ventilation of the malt kilns below, or the brewing vessels. Poor Mr. Pat Shortis was a friend of all of ours, I think. There's Pat as a young man in the Smithwicks brewery, I think the 1940s, but that is the Sullivan's brew kettle. When Sullivan's was bought by Smithwicks and closed down in James's Street, a lot of the equipment moved down to Smithwicks. So that's actually Sullivan's equipment still being used in the 1940s, right up, in fact, to the 1960s when it was replaced. And here's a picture of a young Ron Girdum, which some of you may have heard of. He was kind of quite the famous brewer in Kilkenny from the 50s up to the 80s at least, with the same kettle. So in the 20th century then, from kind of the steam engines and thermometers, you had all of these amazing technical changes, as well as things like prohibition in the States, the repeal of prohibition, the invention of all these different machines and processes to make beer very consistent, and kind of allowed the Anheuser-Busch's and the Guinness to become enormous companies, producing in many countries around the world and so on, and producing very consistent, but I'm afraid sometimes very samey sort of beer. That is what a brewery looks like today. If you visit, for example, the Guinness Brewery in Dublin, that may indeed be it, or it's very close to it. And the one thing that, as you see, that's missing is people. They will be in a little office at the back controlling all this from computers and producing lovely, consistent beer, definitely. But it's all about automation, all about essentially the chemical engineering approach to brewing. And the trouble, as I can attest only too well, the trouble with brewing in a big brewery like this is that that vessel there, for example, may have beer in it today, but it needs to be emptied by 2:15 p.m. on Monday next week, because the next brew is scheduled. So it's brewing very much by the clock, which produces consistency, but it doesn't allow for natural variations and so on in the same way. And that's why not everyone was happy. If you read this glass carefully, it doesn't actually say this beer is awful, tasteless crap. There's actually stuff in between that makes it less offensive. But it was an early example of the craft breweries pushing back. And the early craft kind of advertising was in line with that. You know, this beer kills fascists, brewed by men, not machines. That's the porterhouse, and so on. The brew dog, everyday anarchy, and so on. So making pretty extremely hopped, very, very heavy beers, very heavy flavored beers, as a reaction to the, you know, the Budweisers and the Carlsbergs and so on. It went very extreme. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there was a war, if you like, of the high strength beers for a while between Brewdog and a French or Belgian operation. So this was a bottle of beer, and every bottle came inside a dead animal. So you could buy this as it was about the strength of a whiskey. I think this beer was called Tactical Nuclear Penguin, and the opposing beer was called The End of History. So they really pushed it as far as they could. And as you can see, when you make a beer that strong, it doesn't have a foam anymore. It doesn't hold gas. It's essentially been a lot of the material that we love to make it so strong. So it was going a bit extreme. But it was giving us kind of a much more interesting brewing world in Ireland than we have had for a long time. And that's where the story of the Sullivans' rebirth comes in, with a 7th generation member of the family, that's Alan there on Alan's iPad, and a few of us getting together to get Sullivan's back again. So from 1702, where we began with Daniel O'Connell, who features a lot in our history of Sullivan's, and so on, as we'll learn in a moment. So the Sullivan's history, if this was the Kilkenny Archaeological Society now, this would be the main part of the talk. But for the Rotary, I think we can run over this. But I just put this slide last night with some of the dates that we have been able to pull together. So it's a bit like other stories in Kilkenny. 1656, it seems that Daniel Sullivan was a Protestant who bought property for or on behalf of Pierce Bryan, who was a Catholic, to get around the penal constraints of the time. There's a similar story with Smithwicks beginning, which shows that there was a lot of cooperation and people, as always, finding ways to do the right thing. And then the breweries kicked off by James Bryan, the son of Pierce. And before long, you find the Sullivan's name popping up, and that they've bought a malt house and that they begin to own it. So there's, again, it's kind of hard to trace that history as a straight line, but we do know that Sullivan's were brewing and malting, certainly under their own name by the early 1800s. And then you have interesting history where Richard Sullivan becomes a member of Parliament, and after a brief falling out with Daniel O'Connell, they become fast friends, to such an extent that his son, James, marries Bessie O'Connell, Daniel O'Connell's granddaughter. Bessie, that's in the 1860s, Bessie ends up running the brewery when James dies in 1890. And then you have the turn of the century. By the end of the First World War, Sullivan's is shut and closed to Smithwicks. Debts had accumulated. In particular, there's the lost bet. There's the famous story that young Mr. Sullivan made a bet on a horse race in Deauville in northern France and was not able to cover the bet when he lost. So that was the final blow, and the Sullivan's Brewery was sold. Smithwicks bought it and shut it down until the 1940s, where they started malting in it again. So 2013, then we have Smithwicks closing and the tap room opens. 2016 for Sullivan. So here are some pictures I put together of the story of what we've been doing. That's my dog, the barley inspector, there in a field of barley. There's some malting barley in my hand there, some hops, some of the lovely countryside just outside Kilkenny and Raidstown there. And at the bottom, next to the orchard, is in Birchfield, in Alan's home. That's the shed where we did the first 200-litre brews of Sullivan's, where we developed the recipes before moving to the tap room. Picture of the Sullivan's Brewery. This is from the 1980s. It's a bit foggy, but you know the building next to the Christian Brothers Secondary School off James's Street. That's the building I worked in. I worked 2 years in that maltings, so it's like I can remember the smells and the tastes of it very, very strongly. That's it today. So it's been tidied up, and of course, as you know, there's the cartoon saloon and other operations there now. That pointy kiln roof there, that's this building at the right-hand side is where the malt was kilned or dried over an anthracite fire. The longer building at the left was one floor above another, where the grain was steeped and germinated. And as it grew, it was spread out over the floors and tossed and turned to stop the rootlets knotting together and so on. It was a very, very interesting business to work in for the few years, producing very fine malt, but hopelessly expensive. Does anyone remember this? This is the old gate into the brewery. Back in the 80s, I used to, on the motorbike I had at the time or whatever, come up in the snow. I remember some mornings, 6 a.m. was when we had to start driving through that gate. The head brewer's house was still standing behind it, and the maltings, that's gone now. But you can see Sullivan there at the top, the old archway. Alan has found these around the place in various pubs. People have them to visit. So we have an Amelia now from the Sullivan's history, and that we can see the kind of beers they made. Hop bitters, non-alcoholic one, as well as their sparkling ales and double stout and so on. Some of the early promotional material, but that's a nice one. And we found a few of these jugs. Some for the whiskey of bottles. Sullivan's would have bottled whiskies as well, but you can see there the celebrated ales of Sullivan's again. Other material there. 1702 claim was being made quite early. And here's James again with his wife, lovely in this, his young bride, who ends up running the brewery after he passes away. So one of the taproom brews was we named after her, Bessie Stout. Another one of the nicest of the publicity we have from Sullivan's. So a lovely picture of Kilkenny with the advertising for Sullivan's around it. Billy Wise used to work in the brewery. He's a sub-aqua guy. He used to be involved in, rescue and recovery operations in the sea and in the River Nore and so on. And one day he said that there was zero visibility, but he found something sticking out of the gravel in the River Nore, and it was this sign. So it had probably been buried for 100 years or more when he found it in the 1980s. It's now back with Sullivan's, I'm glad to say. And we love this one as well. A very strange ad for Sullivan's non-intoxicating lager, whatever that means. It does look like they're all getting ready for a fight. It doesn't. It looks very strange. I suspect the artist was probably British rather than Irish, but it does show that maybe teetotal drinks prepare you for life in Ireland or something like that. But that was, I think, the same beer that was also called hop bitters at times. So non-alcoholic drink. And this, we can't tell when this is, but we reckon it's like the 1880s or something like that, maybe even earlier from the dress. So that's the wall in our tap room, which tries to tell the story to visitors. And as you can see, it's not all glamour in the life of a brewer. That was one of the first brews up in the Hellfire Brew Club up in the Dublin Mountains. So as soon as we finished brewing in one vessel, we chucked the grain outside the door and the cows came to eat it up. So it was that was how we started, even before moving to the 200-litre one that we still have in the tap room. So a very artisanal kind of brewing operation with yours truly there. And here's a picture of myself with Alan brewing in the Speedle. This is the unit the little brewery we've used for all of the recipe development and for all the taproom brews. So when you go to the taproom, you see bottles up on the wall, which is the kind of stranger one-offs and seasonals that we brew by hand in the taproom. The base would be, of course, ale malt, which is different to lager malt. Ale malt comes from kind of a better barley, a two-row variety, British or Irish normally, and it's germinated a little bit longer than a lager malt, which means that it is richer in enzymes and converts more easily in the mashing process. So we use ale malt. A great deal of the malt used to produce Sullivan's today is still grown around County Kilkenny. So we use as much Kilkenny malt as we can. Malted in Cork in the MCI, because we don't have a maltings in Kilkenny. Hops, which were grown up to about 2001 in Kilkenny, sadly no longer, but there are people beginning to grow hop that we're keeping an eye on. The secret with Sullivan's, all three of our beers are fermented using a particular yeast that I selected because it had a cask ale history. So you know the reels you get in English bars, that sort of, they have, if you like, preserved yeasts, which work well to give a much more traditional flavor something closer to what Sullivans themselves, to what our great grandfathers would have enjoyed. And our very first brew won a champion award. These are the winners at the International Brewing Awards 2016-17. As you can see, I was convinced to get out of my overalls for this one. And each one of these people has a category award. For example, best cider, or best stout, or best lager. But we won the Champion Ale Award. And the history of this competition is interesting. It's been going back to the 1880. It's a very long-standing brewing competition. Smithwicks won a gold in 1930-something, and they were so delighted that they renamed their bottled beer Smithwicks Number One. That's where the number one came from, because they won a gold medal at this award. Guinness had won a gold medal in the 1920s, but nobody, since 1888, no Irish brewery had ever won a champion. So Sullivan's Red Ale was the first Irish beer ever in that long history to be awarded the overall champion for ale. So you can see a big smile on my face for that one. And there's the trophy, which we got, as well as the gold medal itself. Made, it turns out, by the same person who makes jewelry for Her Majesty, I think, if you look up there somewhere. And then so we started expanding. These are some of our Irish vans for delivery. For our first year or two, we were very focused on supporting pubs with draft Sullivans. But as I mentioned, the American story started almost at the same time. So this is some of our little growing fleet in America. So I think they look really cool, don't they, the brewing vans? So we have, I think, I have a slide later. Alan will correct me, but I think we have something like 8 or 9 reps on the road now, as well as a large number of distributors that I'll get to in the States. It's a very interesting time in the States. We got to meet a lot of great people. That's standing next to Alan there is Frank, our very first brand ambassador. He's in Buffalo, a city we've really come to love. You can see some beer taps there with an American cityscape beside it. And that strange picture of myself and Frank looking at the ground is me boring them all by my passion for geology. This is an early stromatolite outside of Albany in New York. So we got to learn a bit, as well as travel around great parts of the States as we grew our business. So this is an extract from a commercial deck here. It says, so where are we at right now? In Ireland, we're on sale on all O'Brien's outlets and maybe 70 independents. This is in can or bottle. Several of the larger O'Brien's have reported we're among their top selling crafts. And in Ireland, we have 3 full-time salespeople, myself as the brewer, and then the tap room employs around 11 people in its, when it's open. And most of those have part-time work, even in the off-license during COVID. In the States, we're kind of statewide in 9 states now, and still growing. 8 full-time salespeople, as you can see. Certainly in Buffalo and in Cleveland, we'd be very well known at this point, Sullivan's. And it's an interesting thing to say that of all the Irish breweries, we're now the largest independent in the States. And guess what we found when we went to Buffalo? This is the USS Sullivan's. It's an American warship named after the Sullivan brothers, who are the brothers that the Saving Private Ryan story was inspired by. Sadly, they were all lost on the same ship in the Pacific campaign. So after that, the American Navy named a ship after the brothers. It's the only American ship which is named after more than one person. This is the USS the Sullivans, and it is in Buffalo. That's where you go to visit it. These are the 3 Irish food groups. So protein, vitamins, and vegetables here. We have our stout, our gold, and our red, the three beers that we sell. You can the whole idea here, of course, is that Sullivan's is not really chasing the same consumer that the craft breweries are. We're not going for wacky, way out, heavily hopped, sunflower and turnip seed pale ale. We go for a much more kind of classical, well-rounded, full of flavor, but not extreme in any one flavor. It's a little map I tried to put together yesterday, showing where distribution is now in the States. So up here is kind of the Buffalo area around Niagara Falls, and then Western New York. But gradually now we're kind of from Michigan right through to New Jersey. Georgia has been amazing for us. Savannah, the first base. And you can see North Carolina popping in. And really, California needs a little star now as well, but we've just started in California on the East Coast. But it's not really in full distribution yet. So a little point to say thank you very much. And I can tell you, do you remember during the lockout when everyone wanted bread? we went online with our new batch of Sullivans. This never did actually go into production, but I thought it was funny.
Yeah. It's a pity that we can't give everyone an opportunity to taste Sullivan's now. What's the likelihood of the development of the visitor centre in John Street? How is that progressing?
Yeah, there's quite a lot we haven't spoken about there, so I knew we'd take questions. So the next stage in the John Street development is what would you call it? A boutique microbrewery. So that small operation that you saw myself and Alan with, the 200-litre one, and we need something than that, and to support the growth of the visitor centre. So in partnership with the O'Keeffes, you know. So we're looking at putting in a small operation, like less than 1,000 litres of beer, into that area. But that will have its own building. It will be a properly developed brewery to develop micro brewery to develop special seasonals that will be served in the tap room and anywhere else that kind of will look after it, that's interested in having beers that you cannot get anywhere else. They will only be for Kilkenny. So that will be a large part of the tourist attraction.
And apart from seeing the beer being made, what else will be in it? I mean, in the Smithwicks visitor experience, it's quite an elaborate operation with not quite holograms, but moving pictures with, and it takes about 2 hours or maybe slightly less to do the tour. What do you see as the visitor experience in John Street?
We've kind of been tossing and turning around that one a bit. The original idea was to develop purely a visitor centre and follow it with a brewery or some micro-brewing type hands-on brewing experience. But the more we kind of discussed it with kind of Foil to Ireland, with the O'Keeffes themselves, and we got the experience of the tap room and how it grew during non-COVID times, the more it became obvious that the brewing is the core activity, that we're more keen to be a living brewery than to be a museum.
Yeah.
So we don't have the same challenge Smithwicks has of somehow keeping the link with Kilkenny alive for a brewery that doesn't exist in Kilkenny.
Yes.
The Sullivan story is different. We are brewing in Kilkenny in a small way. Our beer is produced under contract for us when we develop the recipes, and we're happy. But I'm always up and down the road, as Alan is, to those breweries. And this is all, the business plan for Sullivan's is quite simple, really. It's building the brand. So, and as you can see, it's growing massively in the States. And when Ireland becomes a level playing field, which it isn't in the on-trade, between the larger breweries squeezing smaller guys out, will also be there. But once we have the brand, then it makes sense to build a commercial brewery. So the taproom microbrewery is not that. At some point in the future, in the next few years, we would hope to be building a commercial brewery, the start of another 300 years of real brewing in Kilkenny. But we're not building a brewery first and then hoping we can sell some beer. We are building the market first, and then the brewery will be needed. Because there comes a point at which it's actually more economical and more profitable, as well as the right thing to do, to brew your own beer, not to go to contract. And so we will be doing that in Kilkenny.
I mean, the development of a brewery really, fundamentally, it relies on taste, the taste of the beer, and finding a beer that meets more than just one person's desire for a beer. And how do you measure what people want and then supply them with the beer that they will enjoy and come back for more?
Yeah, gosh, this is the old question of marketing and product development, isn't it? That if you ask people what they want and you give it to them, you'll find that they've moved on and they don't want what you give them.
Yeah.
So this might sound a bit flippant, but basically we brew the beer I want to brew, beer I like as a brewer. And I haven't come under pressure to dilute that. So the idea is that we brew a good stout that has more flavor and more body than other stouts, but it's still drinkable at the 5% alcohol, you know. A red ale, which is true to what red ale was meant to be, which is kind of a richer and hoppier product than the mass market kind of red ales, you know, much though I like them when I have to have one. And then the gold is kind of our baby. The gold is an unusual one because it's the closest thing to being one of the weirder pale ales, but it's not. It's based on what were called harvest ales in Kilkenny in the kind of, again, the mid-19th century. So it has extra hops in it. It's a bit more hop forward than the other one, but it's got a lovely kind of biscuity malt behind it as well. So we haven't done big market research on the product. We don't adjust the product to suit consumer group 257B. I mean, we brew the beer we like, and people love it, and we haven't been asked to change anything.
Good. And the current restrictions obviously limit what draws people together in a pub. Is the beer selling in off licenses at the moment outside of O'Brien's? You mentioned that they're amongst the top. It's the top seller in O'Brien's. O'Brien's doesn't have an outlet in Kilkenny, as far as I'm aware. So, is our sales holding up during the current pandemic in Ireland?
Well, we've seen a big shift to the canned and bottled product.
Of course.
So, of course, kegs to 20 reelix. There's no keg sale to pubs, you know, such. So that's been a big problem. And I don't mind admitting that we had stocks that we had to destroy because the beer went out of date.
You're not alone in that.
Pardon?
You're not alone in that.
No, not at all. No, no, but we mightn't have pockets as deep as Arthur, you know.
Yes.
We've certainly not been. We've been able to do that in the States and here.
Yeah. And
replace the beer quickly. As I mentioned at the start of the call, maybe not everyone was on it. Like this Thursday is our 5th 40-foot container of beer going to the States this year since January. So, you know, we're just because it's not in Ireland, in the Irish market, that Sullivan's is kind of a hidden success story because it's all going essentially to the States. Now, that's not the long-term plan, but we have one person in England, so exploring some markets for us. And we have some interests from Strain Europe as well. So, plus Sullivan's was very popular in Northern Ireland for a while on draft, very popular in the first year, but there were some commercial issues with other breweries and the distributor we were with. But we will be back. But Alan, I don't know, would it be fair, Alan Smithwick, would you like to unmute? Because you'd be more up to date than I would be on.
Yeah, if you'd like to talk, Alan, you can turn on your microphone.
Yeah, you can hear me there now,
Yes,
Ian, yes?
please.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
Look, even during the global pandemic that we're in, we've taken on 5 new hires since Christmas. And one will be to the west of Ireland, believe it or not. where the bottles and cans are doing very well, from super values to independents. And because of the wholesale business we're in before, friends of the families who have off license and that have taken our product in and distributing and selling well for us down that. And the name Sullivan's or O'Sullivan's really goes well down in West Cork and down the Cork side. Waterford is another very good market for. We have 4 very good off license down there, from World of Wines, O'Brien's, Art Keen Stores and Reddy's, just to name 1 or 2. We had a great last quarter to the year, but the rest of the year was brutal, absolutely brutal. But if you look across our markets now in the States, we're in, I think, 24 distributors, maybe 8 different states. And we've been working last week on shipping beer direct to California instead of sending it to New Jersey. So that would mean sending a container through the Panama Canal and going to the other side of the US. So, you know, a lot of work goes on in the background, you know, that's going on. But, you know, we're doing okay at the moment. You know, we have very good backers, very good investors from the US as well. And a lot of visitors that came to Kilkenny all asked about a brewing facility and where were we brewing and everything. So being able to bring them across the yard and show them where it is and hands-on will be brilliant going forward.
Good, good. Well, I'm reminded, of course, that the name Sullivan comes from the Irish Sulawan, which meant one-eyed. But you have to really have 2 eyes in this business, one to keep an eye on your history and one to keep an eye on the product itself, that the product retains its uniqueness and at the same time it makes itself accessible and drinkable to a broad mass of people. We're coming to the end of our chance to talk today. I'd like to thank both Alan and particularly Ian for the wonderful work that he has done in making this presentation this afternoon, but also for what you're doing for Kilkenny in keeping the brewing tradition alive and vibrant. I think that the addition of the extra tourism facility will add as much as the taste of the beer itself to the enjoyment of people's experience. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we say farewell, Ian?
No, I guess the point is that Sullivan's is available. So don't be shy to find your way to the wine centre or somewhere like that in Kilkenny and get yourself a few bottles or cans. And we will, as soon as we can, we'll be pouring our draft beer again. It's definitely worth a try. And we've been, particularly in the States, we've been kind of pleasantly surprised by how many bars have made our beers their main Irish beer. So others that are more famous have actually been removed to install Sullivan's.
Good.
Based purely on flavour.
Well, that's a good way to end. And I hope that at some stage when we're back meeting in the clubhouse, that you might be able to join us in the clubhouse and we can actually savour a pint of Sullivan's at the end of our meal. Thank you again for your time. What I might do is, if you could send me that video, I'll insert it into the recording.
Oh yes, yeah.
If you send me the link to the video on Vimeo, I'll insert it into the recording and include it when I'm distributing the YouTube video of today's session later on today.
I'll see if I can download it. I'll send you the link so you can view it on Vimeo.
The link will be enough. Yeah, I can look after it after that. Okay, thank you very much.
Only a few minutes long to enjoy it.
Yeah. Can I just butt in and say a quick hello to Ian?
Hi,
Roisin McQuillan here. Hi, how are you doing? Haven't seen you for ages, so just a quick hello from me and from my dad. Just say hi.
That's lovely to hear from you. Thanks very much. Best, will you?
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Listen, thank you all for joining us
today.
Good to
see you again.
And we'll see you next week when we have Selena Grace from the Kilkenny Volunteer Centre. Look after yourselves in the meantime. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.
You're welcome.